They called him crazy because it was easier than admitting he was right. Because if he wasn't insane, then the world was. He didn't snap, he saw. And when he finally understood it all, he stopped pretending he didn't. He was never born a monster. He was born forgotten, a quiet face in the background of a loud, uncaring city. People walked past him the way they walk past cracked concrete, unnoticed, unimportant, unwanted. Arthur Fleck wasn't trying to stand out. He just wanted to exist without being erased. But the world doesn't make room for the fragile. It crushes them under the weight of indifference and laughs when they break. He smiled because it was the only weapon he had. A trembling, pitiful smile painted over bruises that no one asked about. People saw him every day, on buses, in alleyways, in elevators, but not one looked close enough to see the truth. They saw the clown costume, not the man beneath it. They heard the laugh, not the pain that forced it out. To them, he was just a flicker in the corner of their vision, but to himself he was trying, desperately trying, not to fall apart in a world that never noticed he was stitched together by scraps. If you're hearing this, you've already stepped outside the system. Subscribe before they pull you back under. The irony, he wasn't angry, not yet. He believed in kindness, believed in being good. He gave more than he had, smiled when he was mocked, bowed when he was kicked. He thought if he just stayed patient, stayed nice, someone would reach out, someone would care. But reality doesn't reward softness, it devours it. Every act of kindness was met with ridicule. Every plea for help met with silence. Every laugh, a scream in disguise. He tried. He really did. He took his medication, sat through his mandated therapy, showed up to work even when his bones ached from being beaten. He performed for a society that had already decided he didn't matter, that he wasn't worth the breath it would take to acknowledge him. He wasn't asking to be famous, he was asking to be seen. But the city doesn't see men like him until they burn. His mother, fragile and fading, called him happy, as if naming him joy would protect him from despair. But all it did was make the darkness feel deeper. She told him he was born to make people smile, but he couldn't even make himself feel real. He existed in rooms like a ghost, barely acknowledged, never understood. Even his own memories blurred between fact and fiction, between fantasy and trauma. There were secrets buried in his past, but he never had the strength to dig them out. And maybe that was the final trick life played on him, convincing him he was whole when he was already cracked down the middle. There's a pain that doesn't scream. It hums, it lives in your chest like a second heartbeat, thudding quietly, endlessly. That's what Arthur carried. The kind of pain that doesn't get attention because it's not loud enough to scare anyone. The kind that builds in the silence and waits for a trigger. And when it comes, it doesn't explode, it transforms. He was tired, not in the way people complain about on Mondays, not in the way that sleep fixes. He was tired in the bones, in the soul, tired of pretending to be okay in a world that couldn't care less if he disappeared. And slowly that weariness mutated, not into rage, not into sadness, but into clarity, a terrible, beautiful clarity. Before the Joker, there was a man who begged the world for dignity and was answered with fists, a man who held out his hand and was met with emptiness. He walked through life like it owed him nothing, because it had proven that it didn't. He laughed, not because things were funny, but because if he didn't, he might shatter. His whole life had been a balancing act on the edge of collapse, and every day, the world added more weight to his shoulders, daring him to fall. Arthur Fleck wasn't a warning, he was a result, a product of thousands of invisible cuts. Society didn't fear him because he was evil, it feared him because it created him, and deep down it knew. Deep down it saw the reflection and hated it. He never wanted the world to burn, he just wanted it to notice the ashes. But when it didn't, when it laughed in his face, when it kicked him while he was down and told him to smile harder, he stopped asking for help, stopped waiting for mercy. That was the day Arthur Fleck died, not with a bang, but with a whisper. He didn't put on the Joker's face to become someone new. He put it on to finally reveal who he'd always been, what they pushed him into, what they never thought he had the strength to become. A mirror, a message, a man they couldn't control anymore. And once he saw the world for what it really was, once he understood there was no going back, he laughed when he was in pain. Not because he found it funny, because that was all he had left. His laughter wasn't an escape. It was a symptom, a glitch, a defense mechanism trapped inside a man who had been stretched so thin by reality that even his nerves began to misfire. And so he laughed. At the wrong times, in the wrong places, around the wrong people, and they hated him for it, not because he was a threat, but because he reminded them that pain wears a smile long before it ever wears a mask. Arthur never asked to be laughed at. All he wanted was to belong, to matter. But the world doesn't reward quiet desperation. It steps over it, kicks it, mocks it. In a city built on noise, Arthur's voice was a whisper, drowned out by car horns, sirens, and the laughter of strangers who never saw him. But oh, how they stared when he laughed. That painful, involuntary gasp from deep inside his lungs, shaky, desperate, broken. They stared like he was diseased. They stared like his pain was repulsive. And it was, to them, because it was too real. He tried to hold it in. He tried everything. Pills, therapy, notes scribbled into spiral notebooks. But the laughter never listened. It came when he was terrified, when he was humiliated, when he stood in front of a crowd hoping to make them laugh for the right reasons, and ended up bleeding instead. It erupted from him like a betrayal, his own body turning against him, and every time it did, people backed away, disgusted, afraid. They didn't see a man unraveling, they saw a freak, a spectacle, a malfunction in the system of polite, controlled society. What they never understood was that his laughter wasn't joy, it was code, a hidden language of agony translated into sound. He laughed because he didn't know how to scream anymore, because crying got him nowhere, because anger made him the villain and silence made him invisible. So he laughed, a broken man in a broken world, and instead of reaching for him, they pushed him further down, into the cracks, into the shadows, into himself. Every chuckle was a scar, every giggle, a wound splitting open, the kind no one cared to bandage. The city moved too fast for sorrow, too proud for compassion. They heard the laughter, but never the pain underneath it. They saw the clown, but never the man suffocating under the makeup. He became a parody of his own suffering, a walking contradiction. The man who laughed too much but felt too deeply. Strangers pointed, co-workers whispered. Even his mother, his one tether to warmth, called him special, but not in the way he needed, not in the way that made him feel human. They told him to be strong, but mocked the only strength he had left, endurance. And so he endured, one laugh at a time, each one chipping away at what little he still believed in. The laughter followed him, on buses, in elevators, in empty rooms where the silence felt like judgment. He laughed when he remembered being beaten, laughed when he thought about being abandoned, laughed when he sat in therapy sessions, pretending the pills were helping. But deep down he knew the laughter wasn't getting louder, it was getting darker. There's something terrifying about watching a man laugh while he's breaking. It unsettles people, reminds them of the line between sanity and surrender. Arthur stood on that line for years, until one day he realized he'd already crossed it. The laughter didn't just spill out of him, it lived in him, became him. It didn't need a reason anymore. It was the reason. That's when the world started to pay attention, but not because they cared, because they were afraid. Because laughter, when stripped of happiness, becomes something else entirely. A sound that doesn't ask for comfort, it demands it. That mocking, shrill, choking noise that said, "I see through you. I see the cruelty behind your smile, the apathy behind your charity, the rot beneath your rules." They labeled him unstable, dangerous, insane. But insanity is just what they call truth spoken in a language they don't want to hear. Arthur wasn't crazy. He was fluent in suffering, fluent in the language of a world that doesn't care until it's too late. The irony, he never wanted to laugh again. He wanted to speak, to be heard, to be seen without the filter of discomfort or pity. But when the world denies you a voice, it forces you to scream through other means, and his scream was laughter. He became a man haunted by his own echo. Every laugh, a reminder that the world laughed first at him, before the costume, before the violence, before the transformation. They laughed at the man who just wanted to be good. And when he finally laughed back, they couldn't take it, because his laughter held a mirror to their masks, and what they saw was far uglier than any clown. Laughter in Arthur's world wasn't madness, it was survival, it was defiance, a rebellion painted in smiles and screams. And when the world begged for him to stop, when they begged for silence, he finally understood the joke, the greatest one of all. They never wanted him to be sane, they wanted him to stay quiet, and he was done being quiet. They saw him every day, and yet they never really saw him. Just another face in the decay of the city's underbelly, another man with sunken eyes and a nervous smile, another body filling space but taking up none. He moved like a shadow, trying to convince itself it still had weight, and the world oidless. It didn't just ignore him, it kicked him, spit on him, mocked him. Day after day, Arthur wasn't just invisible, he was disposable. They didn't see the way his hands shook when he handed over a flyer in his clown uniform. They didn't notice how his laughter caught in his throat, not because of joy, but because of the disease lodged in his chest, one that made him sound like he was losing control, even when all he wanted was to hold it together. They shoved him, laughed at him, filmed him while he bled. No sympathy, no second glances, just the viral satisfaction of watching someone fall apart. The city had no use for men like Arthur, not unless they were entertaining. And he tried. God, he tried. He painted his face, stretched his smile, bowed when expected, but still they beat him like he owed them something. Still they talked over him like he wasn't speaking at all. His therapist didn't listen, his employer didn't care, his neighbors barely nodded. Every room he entered was already full. He was always too much or not enough, never exactly right, never exactly seen. When he got jumped in the alley, it wasn't surprising, not to him. They broke his sign, broke his ribs, broke the last thread of dignity had left, and when he screamed, when he cried, the world looked away. Or worse, they smirked. Pain is entertainment when it's not yours. His agony became part of the background noise. Siren, scream, laughter, repeat. They loved him silent. They loved him small. They loved that he tried so hard to be decent, even when no one was decent. There was something comforting about watching a man drown while still thanking the sea. It made them feel better about their own cowardice. It reminded them that it was safer to mock the broken than admit they were next. Every institution failed him. The hospital gave him medication but not meaning. The social worker asked questions but never heard the answer. The system looked down from its towers and tossed scraps, expecting gratitude return. But Arthur, he took it. He took everything, until he didn't, because after enough betrayal, something breaks, not in the loud, violent way people expect, but in a quiet, a subtle click in the mind, the realization that you are the only one in the room who ever cared if you lived or died, that no one is coming, that no one ever was. They thought he was harmless because he was quiet, because he smiled, because he didn't fight back. But that was the mistake, because people like Arthur, they don't explode, they evolve. He started to see things for what they were. The jokes weren't funny. The news wasn't truth. The city wasn't sick. It was functioning exactly as designed. The rich laughed on top while the poor fought at the bottom. And in between, people like him. Invisible glue holding together a machine that never once acknowledged their value. Arthur wasn't delusional. He was observant. And once he stopped looking at the world with hopeful eyes, he started seeing it with clear ones. They didn't break him because he was weak. They broke him because he had the audacity to try to be kind in a world that eats kindness alive. And when he killed the men on the train, those drunken suits who kicked him just for existing, it wasn't revenge. It was silence answering violence. It was the end of permission. He didn't plan it. He just stopped holding it in. That subway didn't become a crime scene. It became a mirror, a reflection of everything that had always been wrong. They called it madness. They called it tragedy. But what else do you call it when the world creates a monster and then acts shocked when it turns around and bites? Arthur had been their punching bag, their joke, their warning sign of what happens when you don't fit. But he was done being laughed at, done being grateful for abuse, done being the ghost everyone could see but no one dared speak to. He stood taller, smiled wider, painted the pain into something beautiful and horrifying, because if the world was going to treat him like a villain, he'd become the one they deserved, not out of rage, out of clarity, out of understanding that in a city that feeds on cruelty, sanity is surrender. And when the cameras finally turned on him, when his name became more than a file in a forgotten drawer, they didn't see Arthur. They saw the reflection of their failure, a man who absorbed every slap, every rejection, every insult, and transformed it into truth. Ugly, loud, undeniable truth. The Joker wasn't born in that moment. He was revealed, unmasked, finally free to become what the world made him. No longer afraid, no longer invisible, not society's favorite punching bag anymore. Now he was the fist. He waited for answers, for kindness, for someone to finally look at him, not through him. Every day he sat with the echo of hollow voices and empty eyes, hoping maybe this time someone would ask how he was and actually mean it. But no one did. The city kept moving, the lights kept blinking, and every face that passed him wore the same expression, indifference. He used to believe people were good, deep down, that if you just smiled enough, tried hard enough, stayed patient long enough, they'd eventually see you. But they didn't, and something in him, something old, silent, and tired, began to shift. It didn't happen all at once. You don't fall off a cliff. You erode, slowly, piece by invisible piece. He didn't scream when it started. He didn't cry. He didn't even speak. He just sat, a little quieter, stared a little longer. The world had taught him one truth over and over. Empathy is a luxury for the loved, and he was the forgotten, the background noise in a city too loud to care. His smile stopped reaching his eyes. His laugh became shorter. He started to notice how fake everyone was, how quickly they looked away when he walked by. They said he made them uncomfortable, but no one ever asked what it felt like to be him. He'd show up to therapy and be handed pills, be told to write in a journal, be reminded that his negative thoughts were irrational, but no one treated the world he lived in like it was irrational. A world where the poor were mocked, where the rich could lie and be praised, where the people who claimed to care only cared when they were watched. He was expected to act sane in a world built on madness, and that contradiction, it began to rot the core of his beliefs. What was sanity in a place like this? A mask, a performance, a sedative. So he stopped pretending, not all at once, but enough. He stopped waiting for someone to rescue him from the wreckage. He realized no one was coming. There was no help, no justice, no fairness. There was just survival. and if the world was going to treat him like a ghost, then he'd haunt them in return. If they wanted a monster, he'd oblige, but he wouldn't be a blind one. He'd be sharp, focused, honest in a way that hurt. That was the difference. He didn't become violent because he lost control. He became violent because he stopped lying to himself. He saw the world clearly now, and the clarity was unbearable. There was no reward for being good, no safety in obedience. You could spend your whole life smiling, nodding, playing by the rules, and still be stepped on, mocked, discarded. That realization doesn't free you gently, it crushes you first. And then, if you survive, it hardens you into something else, something terrifying. He walked differently now, not hunched in shame but straight, like the weight he carried had turned into armor. The silence that once felt like suffocation had become serenity. He didn't need their validation anymore, didn't care to be understood. When he looked in the mirror, he saw something new. Not Arthur, not the broken boy begging to be seen. He saw someone reborn in the ashes of his own delusion. He saw a man no longer waiting for permission to feel, and he started to smile again. Not the nervous twitch of someone trying to be liked, but the slow curling grin of someone who knew a secret no one else did. He wasn't afraid anymore, not of rejection, not of being alone. He had already faced the worst thing a person could feel, invisibility, and once you survive that, nothing else can touch you. They would say he snapped, that he went crazy, but they were wrong. He woke up. He saw what no one wanted to admit, that society only works if everyone pretends to care, pretends to be happy, pretends that the rules mean something. But he wasn't pretending anymore. He was done playing, done hoping, done bleeding for people who wouldn't have noticed if he died in the street. He didn't want revenge, he wanted freedom, and the only way to be free was to stop needing them. In the quiet, he heard it, not voices, not madness, but clarity, the space between thoughts where truth lives, and that truth, it was ugly, beautiful, powerful. The world wasn't broken, it was designed this way, and he was done being its victim. Empathy didn't die in him, it was murdered, slowly, by years of apathy, by systems that failed him, by a city that demanded he smile while it bled him dry. And when empathy died, something else rose, not hate, not rage, but something pure, cold, focused, strategic. He had nothing left to lose, and that made him dangerous. Because when a man has no more illusion, no more dreams, no more desperate attachments to a world that spits in his face, he becomes unstoppable, not in the heroic way, not in the noble sense, but in the terrifying clarity of someone who has seen the world for what it is and refuses to play along. He didn't choose chaos, he chose truth, and the world called it madness, because the truth makes cowards of most men, but not him. He finally understood everything, and that's when the real story began. Arthur didn't die in the alley. He didn't die when they beat him in the subway. He didn't even die when society turned its back on. No, Arthur Fleck died the moment he realized the world would never apologize. The moment he stopped waiting for the call, the hug, the second chance. That's when the Joker was born. He didn't crawl out of chaos. He was sculpted by it, not with fire, but with silence, with the sound of doors closing, laughter erupting, voices mocking. Day after day, he kept showing up with hope in his pocket and humanity in his eyes. But hope is a cruel thing in a world that feeds on suffering, and humanity, it was currency he could no longer afford. The suit wasn't fashion, it was armor. The makeup wasn't disguise, it was revelation. When Arthur first looked into the mirror after painting his face, it didn't feel foreign, it felt honest. The colors didn't hide who he was, they told the truth in a way words never could. Red for rage, blue for sorrow, white for detachment. The Joker didn't wear a mask, he took one off. For years, Arthur tried to be small. He tried to be harmless. The quiet guy on the bus, the forgettable voice on stage. He wanted to be seen, but never too much. Wanted to matter, but never to offend. But the world doesn't reward soft souls. It devours them. And so when the last shred of mercy left his chest, something else filled the void. Something colder, sharper, louder. The gun wasn't just metal. It was punctuation. The exclamation mark at the end of every insult. Every bruise, every empty room. He didn't pull the trigger to kill. He pulled it to speak. Because no one listened until the blood hit the floor. Until the laughter turned into screaming. Until the guy no one remembered became the only one on the news. That's the joke. You can scream in pain, and they'll walk past you. But if you smile while the world burns, they can't look away. The Joker wasn't created in a single moment. He was built brick by brick, like a monument to society's failures. Every time someone called him a freak, every time a stranger looked through him like glass, every system that promised help but offered pills and paperwork instead, they didn't fix it. They buried him, alive, and now they act surprised he clawed his way out. What they never understood was that Arthur never wanted to be a villain. He just wanted to matter, to be heard. But when the only language society respects is violence, what other choice is left? He didn't pick up the match to watch the city burn. He lit it to keep warm. The fire just got out of control. That stage on TV, the moment he sat across from the man who used to mock him, that wasn't entertainment. That was confession. That was confrontation. Arthur didn't care about fame. The Joker didn't care about laughs. What he wanted was acknowledgement, a moment of truth, a crack in the mask of civility. And when that moment didn't come, when the world laughed one last time, he stopped asking. There's a difference between madness and transformation. Arthur's descent wasn't the unraveling of a mind. It was the sharpening of a vision, a realization that the rules were never real, that justice is a performance, morality is a costume, and sanity is just whatever makes others feel comfortable. And when he let go of the need to be understood, he became free. You can only betray a man so many times before he stops trying to be good, before the line between right and wrong stops mattering. That's what they never saw. Arthur wasn't trying to be evil. He just stopped pretending good had a place in his story. The Joker wasn't born in chaos. He created it, piece by piece, not out of vengeance, but out of logic. Because once you understand the system is rigged, the only sane response is to flip the board. They thought he was lost, that he had no compass. But the truth is, he was the only one following a straight line, a line drawn in blood, pain, and clarity, and he walked it with a smile, not because he enjoyed the carnage, but because the laughter was the only thing left that didn't lie to him. He didn't need to be liked anymore, or loved, or forgiven. He didn't crave approval. That's what made him untouchable. That's what made him powerful. Arthur Fleck vanished, not with a scream, not with a gunshot. He faded with a smile that said, "I see you now." A smile that wasn't broken, but complete. And in his place stood the Joker, every laugh a funeral for the man he used to be. They should have helped him when he was silent, because now his silence speaks louder than their siren. They laughed at him first. That's the part people forget. They laughed when his hands trembled, when his words fell apart in mid-sentence, when the world slipped out from beneath his feet like some rigged stage trap. They laughed when he cried, when he tried, when he failed, and he took it. He absorbed the laughter like a sponge soaks up poison, holding it inside long enough for it to change him. Then one day he laughed back, and it wasn't funny anymore. The world called it madness, but he knew better. Madness is random. This was precise, purposeful, surgical. His every movement, every grin, every crack of laughter wasn't chaos. It was reflection, a mirror turned on society so violently that people had to look away or admit the truth. They made him. He didn't walk into their world with a loaded gun and painted smile out of boredom. He walked in because they left him no other door. He knocked politely, quietly for years, and no one answered. So he broke it down. That's not insanity. That's cause and effect. The real punchline was this. They called him evil, but they built every piece of him. Every red light ignored, every voice unheard, every humiliating glance, every system that said try harder while pressing a boot to his throat. Those were the ingredients. And when he finally stood up, blood on his hands and laughter on his lips, they wanted to act shocked. That was the joke. They never cared who he was, only what he became when he stopped playing by their rules. He didn't want sympathy. He didn't even want revenge. He wanted clarity. He wanted to show them the reflection they spent their whole lives avoiding, the version of themselves they buried under 9-to-5's fake morality and borrowed virtue. He exposed the absurdity of their carefully scripted world, where criminals wear suits and killers sign laws, where the mentally ill are left to rot and the corrupt are handed microphones. He became what they feared, not because he was insane, but because he made sense. He stopped pretending that smiling while you're dying is noble. He stopped pretending that silence was sanity, that obedience was virtue. And in doing so, he flipped the script. People called his actions evil, but what's more evil? One man losing control, or 1,000 who pretend they never had it to begin with? When he pulled the trigger, it wasn't a random act. It was a statement, a violent punctuation mark in a sentence no one would read, a scream in a city trained to ignore pain unless it's profitable. It wasn't about the man on the floor. It was about the world that put him there. The world that cheers violence in film but gasps when it's real, that sells suffering in headlines, then discards the people living it. He didn't bring madness, he revealed it. The smile painted across his face wasn't joy, it was surrender, not to the chaos but to the truth. The truth that the system is broken, that society is a machine built on quiet cruelty, and that the only ones who survive are those willing to burn the instruction manual. He understood that now, and once you understand that, once you really get it, how do you go back to playing nice? He used to beg to be seen. Now he made them look. He made them squirm, because in him they saw everything they tried to bury, their apathy, their duplicity, their comfort in watching others drown. He was a monster, sure, but he was their monster. They made him, fed him, shaped him, then blamed him for becoming exactly what they asked for. And in some sick way they needed him, because deep down they craved a villain to point at, someone to absorb the guilt they couldn't carry, someone to name when the city burned. Not the policies, not the greed, not the neglect, but him. It was easier, simpler, cleaner, but he knew the truth behind their accusations. They weren't afraid of his madness. They were afraid of what it revealed about them. He didn't smile because he was crazy. He smiled because he finally got the joke. The cruel, absurd, brilliant joke that the world only listens when you scream, that they only see you when you force their eyes open, and that the only difference between a hero and a villain is who's telling the story. So he told his own. With bullets and laughter and blood-stained truth, he wrote his version, not to be worshipped, not to be pitied, but to be remembered. Because in a city where no one listens unless something's on fire, he became the flame. They wanted him to be quiet, to be normal, to be invisible, but he refused. He stepped into their world wearing the face they gave him, and made sure they'd never forget it. The joke was never on him. It was always on them. They called him insane because sanity required obedience, because sanity in their world meant following rules built by cowards, enforced by bullies, and defended by silence. They whispered crazy, not because he had lost touch with reality, but because he finally saw it for what it really was. That's what they fear most. Not the man who breaks, but the one who sees too clearly. He didn't wake up one morning and decide to be chaos. He watched order collapse, one cracked promise at a time. He trusted the system. It crushed him. He asked for help. They gave him pills and blank stares. He reached for connection. They mocked him. And slowly that idea, the one they call madness, started to make sense. Maybe the world wasn't broken. Maybe it was built wrong. So he stopped apologizing. He stopped explaining. He stopped trying to fit into a structure that was designed to erase men like him. The more he let go, the more free he became. It wasn't madness. It was clarity without chains, the kind that scares people, because it doesn't flinch, it doesn't conform, it doesn't ask permission to exist. They wanted him to be predictable, digestible, safe, but he had seen what safety really was. A leash, a trick, a word they used to sell submission in shiny packaging. He'd been safe all his life, and it only got him laughed at, beaten down, thrown away. So he chose something else. He didn't crave violence. He craved real. And real in this world, real is brutal. Real is dirty. Real doesn't care about your hashtags or polite conversations. Real shows you your reflection and dares you to keep looking. So when he turned toward that reflection and smiled, they called him lost. But he wasn't lost. He was just done pretending. Sanity told him to smile when he was falling apart, to pay rent with no job, to bow to power and say thank you for the crumbs. It told him pain should be endured quietly, that silence was strength, that struggle was noble. But he learned. He saw that all that noble suffering was just a leash society handed the broken to keep them obedient. So he snapped the leash, and suddenly he wasn't the victim anymore. He was the wolf, not because he wanted to hurt, but because he refused to be hunted. That shift, that moment when the mind stops clinging to hope and starts embracing the fire, that's the birth of something they can't control. That's when the rules stop working, because a man with nothing to lose doesn't ask for directions. He redraws the map. Madness, they say, but what is madness in a world that treats empathy like a weakness and lies like a virtue? What is madness in a place where the cruel get rich and the kind die quiet? You call him crazy for rejecting it, but maybe you're just too afraid to admit he's right, that the real madness is pretending any of this makes sense. He saw through the lies, the polite society, the news anchors and politicians, the therapists with fake smiles and empty clipboards. He saw the masks everyone wore, not for costume but survival. The rich wore masks of virtue while they stole. The poor wore masks of pride while they starved. And the masses, they wore the mask of distraction, praying to stay numb enough to forget what they already knew. It's all a show, a violent, beautiful, blood-soaked circus. So he became the only honest thing in it. He wore his mask on the outside. They wore theirs on the inside. And that's what made them so angry. He exposed them by existing. His laughter wasn't a sound, it was a mirror. Every giggle echoed the truth they tried to bury, that their jobs, their routines, their fake smiles were no different than his, just better packaged. You see, when the line between madness and clarity blurs, most people cling to their scripts, but he burned his, and in the ashes he found something stronger than acceptance. He found power. Because when you let go of needing to belong, needing to be liked, needing to be saved, you become untouchable. He didn't flinch when they threatened. He didn't beg when they judged. He laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was over. The need to be sane. That's the last shackle, the final lie. Sanity was just the name they gave to cages, and he had no use for cages anymore. So he walked through fire with a grin. Not because he was immune to pain, but because he no longer feared it. Pain was familiar, predictable. Pain never lied. It was people who lied. systems,
Smiles.
institutions. His madness wasn't chaos. It was liberation. And now they couldn't understand him.
That was the point.
You can't understand what you refuse to look at.
So they labeled, they pathologized, they whispered, he lost it. But he didn't lose anything. He shed everything. Everything fake. Everything forced. Everything they told him to be.
He saw the world for what it was. And in doing so, he found something most people spend their entire lives chasing: control. Not over others, over himself. He no longer lived in their world. He walked beside it, watched it, laughed at it, and when necessary, burned it. Because in a world like this, maybe the only sane response is madness. They thought he'd disappear, fade into a headline, another body in the gutter, another lunatic with face paint and a camera fixated on him for 15 seconds before moving on to the next scandal. But Joker didn't vanish. He multiplied. The city had always been on the edge, cracks beneath the surface, smiles stretched too tight, streets filled with laughter that didn't reach the eyes. People were tired, exhausted, not just from work or poverty, but from pretending everything was fine, from swallowing disrespect, from watching the powerful mock them through television screens while sipping
Wine in penthouses built on broken backs. And then, there he was. Not Arthur. Arthur was dead. What stood in his place now was the result of every slap, every silence, every smirk from men who thought power made them untouchable. Joker wasn't just a man he was the moment when repressed rage found a mask and said, "No more."
The city didn't riot because of Joker. It rioted because Joker told the truth. They were all choking. He was just the match. The gasoline had been pouring for years, and the first flame was broadcast live. He didn't blink. He didn't stutter. He sat in that studio chair, surrounded by $1 million lights, a laughing audience, and a man who had once humiliated him on national television. And he told the world exactly what it was. You decide what's funny, what's crazy, who deserves to be heard. They laughed until the moment he didn't flinch, until the moment the gun came out, until the moment the punchline hit harder than they expected. It wasn't murder, it was confession. And the world watched, not just in horror, but in silence, in reflection, in recognition, because deep down they understood. That laugh wasn't madness, it was a mirror. The chaos that followed wasn't his doing. He didn't ask for the masks, the fires, the screams in the night. But when a man tells the truth and bleeds on camera, it forces everyone watching to admit what they've ignored. People didn't riot for Joker. They rioted because they saw themselves in him. They wore the clown masks not to mimic his insanity, but to shed their own. The facade of politeness, the restraint, the fear of stepping out of line. Joker tore off his mask and gave them permission to do the same. And it terrified the ones in power, because this wasn't rebellion for the sake of noise. It was rebellion born from clarity. What happens when the man you mocked becomes a symbol? What happens when the one you tried to erase becomes the ink others use to write their story? They called him a villain, a killer, a monster, but the people called him something else. Truth, not the clean kind, not the heroic kind, the kind that stinks, the kind that makes your stomach twist, the kind that forces you to look in the mirror and ask, how long have I been wearing a mask just to survive? The city didn't need Joker to show them how broken everything was. They already knew. He just gave them a face for it, a voice. And once people feel seen, truly seen, something irreversible happen. They stop obeying. They stop apologizing. They stop playing along. The revolution wasn't planned. It didn't have banners or slogans or leaders. It had rage. It had hunger. It had years of invisible wounds now screaming in unison. And every broken window, every burning car, Every roar into the night sky whispered the same thing. We see it now, we feel it now, and we won't pretend anymore. They tried to blame him for it. The government, the media, the rich, but it was already too late, because you can't kill an idea. And Joker was no longer just a man. He was proof that a society that ignores its wounded will eventually have to answer to its monsters. People don't become dangerous when they lose their minds. They become dangerous when they stop lying to themselves, when they accept that the system was never built for them, that kindness was used as a muzzle, that being good only works in fairy tales. He didn't ask to be followed, but they followed anyway, not because they loved him, but because they recognized the music he played, that twisted waltz of sorrow and rage, that unspoken rhythm of being stepped on so long that eventually you bite. The city danced to it, and when the smoke rose, when the sirens wailed, when the headlines screamed terror, he simply smiled, not because it was funny, but because for the first time the joke wasn't on him. They called him Chaos because he stopped pretending order existed. In the world he walked through, people lined up to obey invisible rules, rules they didn't write, didn't question, and didn't even understand. They worshipped normalcy like a god, kneeling at the altar of comfort and illusion. As long as things looked fine on the surface, no one cared what was rotting underneath. The bills piling up, the father who drank instead of spoke, the mother smiling through black eyes, the lies passed off as small talk, the fake laughs at jobs they hated, the slow death of authenticity in exchange for belonging. That was sanity, that was order, and Joker saw it for what it really was, a prison built by cowards and policed by fear. He didn't burn the city because he hated it. He burned it because it was already on fire. He just made sure everyone saw the flames. He used to try to play the part. He really did. Took the pills, nodded when spoken to, forced the smile, wore the mask. But the longer he played along, the more he saw it. None of them believed in the rules they clung to. The same people who told him to get help mocked him for being broken. The same people who spoke of kindness turned their backs the moment he needed it. They said ask for help, but what they really meant was suffer silently and don't make us uncomfortable. The system wasn't failing. It was functioning perfectly for those it was designed to protect, and he was never one of them. So he stopped asking for help, stopped playing the part, stopped dressing his wounds in the costume of self-control. And when he did, they said he went mad. But really, he just got honest. You see, the world doesn't fear chaos. It fears honesty, real, raw, nothing left to lose honesty. That's why they locked him away. Not because he was a threat, but because he was proof that anyone, given enough pain, enough silence, enough betrayal, could wake up and realize the whole thing's a rigged game. That good is just branding, that law is just control, that sanity is just collective denial, dressed in clean clothes. He used to think he was alone, that he was the only one who saw the cracks. But then came the masks, the riots, the cheers, the fires in the street, and suddenly the joke didn't feel so personal anymore. Suddenly, the punchline echoed from the mouths of hundreds, thousands, all wearing that painted grin, all finally admitting that the Emperor had no clothes, and hadn't for a long, long time. That's the real reason they feared him, not because he was unpredictable, but because he was honest in a world where everyone else was pretending. He didn't bring chaos, he revealed it. Order, that was the lie. That was the story whispered to children to keep them in line. Be good and good things happen. Follow the rules and you'll be okay. But he followed the rules. He obeyed. He endured. And still, the world chewed him up and laughed while he bled. What good was order if it only protected the ones holding the leash? No, order wasn't justice. It was convenience. The real world wasn't black and white. It was smeared in gray, painted in blood, hidden behind locked doors and polite smiles. And once you saw that, once you really saw it, you couldn't go back. The Joker understood that. That's why they called him insane. Because if he wasn't, then they were the crazy ones for pretending it all made sense. He didn't want chaos for the sake of destruction. He wanted truth. Ugly, brutal, unfiltered truth. And the truth is, people don't want truth. They want comfort. They want control. And when someone tears the mask off and shows the ugliness underneath, they call it madness. Because that's easier than admitting they've built their lives on lies. He knew what he was doing. Every step, every shot, every explosion. It wasn't random, it was poetry. A message written in smoke and blood and laughter. A final punchline to a joke the city refused to understand. Because if the world can ignore a man suffering long enough, they don't deserve to act surprised when he turns it into a spectacle. So no, he wasn't the villain they claimed. He was the mirror. The one held up to a society so used to pretending that seeing its reflection made it scream. The Joker never declared war. He just stopped playing dead. And in the silence that followed, in the ash and the chaos, people saw the truth that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't gone mad at all. Maybe he had finally, painfully, perfectly understood everything. He didn't arrive at madness like the world claimed. He arrived at understanding, sharp, cold, and blinding in its clarity. And that understanding didn't come with peace. It came with laughter, the kind that splits silence like a blade. Not because it's funny, but because it's horrifying. Because once you truly see the world for what it is, not what it pretends to be, you either go mad or you laugh. And he chose laughter. They said he snapped, that he broke, that he lost his mind in a spiral of grief and violence. But he didn't lose anything. He found it, the truth. He found the architecture of the lie. Saw the layers society stacks like cards, pretending it's a house. Rules built for obedience, not order. Morality sold as a product, not practice. Justice only offered to those who can afford it. Love turned into a game of performance. He didn't descend into chaos. He escaped the illusion. He spent his life trying to play the part. Smile wide, walk straight, take your meds, say thank you, be kind, even when the world spits in your face. He tried to be someone that people could care about. But the truth was never about care. It was about convenience. The moment he stopped being useful, he became invisible. The moment he stopped being passive, he became dangerous. Not because he was violent, but because he no longer needed their approval. He stopped trying to be understood. That's what freed him. He didn't speak to be heard anymore. He wasn't performing for empathy. He realized no one listens unless you scream. No one sees you until you break something. And by then, you're already the villain. That's the irony. They only started looking when he made them afraid. But by then, the old him was already dead. He didn't become the Joker to be feared. He became the Joker because he finally accepted that fear was the only language they respected. He wore the makeup, not to hide, but to reveal, to show them exactly what they created. A world so devoid of compassion that the only way to be seen is to become a spectacle. A system so rigged that the only way to disrupt it is to set it on fire and laugh while it burns. They labeled him insane to protect themselves, because if he wasn't crazy, if his rage made sense, then their entire belief system would collapse. If a man like him, quiet, obedient, forgotten, could turn into that, then maybe the problem isn't in the man, but in the world that ignored him. And that thought, that's what really terrified them, because it meant they were complicit. He understood something most never will. Sanity is a performance, a social contract. You smile when expected, nod at the right moments, pretend to care, pretend to be okay, but deep down you're bleeding, drowning, screaming in your pillow. And the world claps as long as your mask stays on. But take it off, show the real face beneath. You're dangerous, unstable, mad. But he wasn't mad. He was awake. And once your eyes open, they don't close again. You see the cruelty beneath the routine, the hunger behind the smiles, the manipulation dressed as affection. You see that people don't want truth. They want comfort. And anyone who threatens that comfort gets labeled, exiled, destroyed. That's what they tried to do to him. Paint him as the freak, the anomaly, the broken one. But the only thing broken was the game they expected him to keep playing. He stopped chasing redemption. He stopped apologizing for the fire inside him, for the pain in his voice. He embraced the chaos, not because he wanted to destroy the world, but because the world had already destroyed him. And once you've been through that kind of hell, you realize the rules were never made to protect you. They were made to keep you in line, keep you small, keep you quiet. So he made noise, beautiful, terrifying noise, a symphony of shattered masks, of collapsed illusions, of forced smiles turned into screams. He became the storm because the sky never made room for his light. He turned his scars into symbols, his breakdown into a blueprint, his madness into meaning. You can call him crazy, you can call him a monster, but deep down you know the truth. He saw it all, every lie, every betrayal, every mask, and instead of flinching, he laughed. He wasn't afraid of the dark, he became it. Because when you've lived your whole life waiting for someone to save you and no one ever comes, you stop waiting. You become your own God, your own fire, your own justice. And maybe that's what sanity truly is. Not conformity, but clarity. The clarity to see that the only way to survive a sick world is to stop pretending it's healthy. The courage to stop smiling when everything's on fire. The strength to walk alone, even when the world points and whispers. He didn't lose his mind. He reclaimed it. He didn't go mad. He finally understood everything.